So the focus of my talk today is going to be this great ancient Roman portrait, who was a priest of the Egyptian goddess Isis. We don't really know a ton about this specific person, but we can explore the ancient Romans' really deep interest in Egypt and Egyptian religion. And I should say too, this is a very rich topic. There are many, many books on it. We could spend a year-long course on it together. So I'll give you hopefully some of the highlights in this. So we'll start with the portrait head, our priest. We'll take a little look at him first and then get into some of the aspects of the ancient Roman world that he can help us illuminate. So this portrait was purchased from an art dealer in Rome in 1881 and was gifted to the museum in 1902 by Mrs. Joseph Cook. So we're looking at the head of a man around life size. And I should say, if you want to see him afterwards, he's tucked into the corner, the ambulatory side. We get a little bit of kind of fleshy detail around his mouth and chin. He's got some lines above his brow. And we do get a little bit of good kind of nugget of information when we look at his eyes. So for a long time, detail in the eyes in Roman portraiture was painted on. And after the mid-2nd century CE, sculptors started incising the pupils with a drill. We don't see any incised lines here, so we're looking at a portrait pre-mid-2nd century, probably late 1st, early 2nd century CE. So the eyes would have been painted on, and like the eyes, a lot of other details would have been painted on. We know that pretty much all sculpture from antiquity was painted in various colors. So here we're probably talking about skin tones and shading and maybe some other details. His nose, as you can kind of tell from the flanking images with this kind of unsettling bit sticking out, his nose is a later repair, so it's not part of the original statue. In a fun, kind of interesting twist, there was some isotropic signature analysis, so some scientific study done on the stone of both the head and the nose. They're actually the same type of stone, a type of marble called Proconesian, which comes from modern Turkey. But the nose isn't original, even if it looks pretty good now. It's the same stone. So we know where the stone was quarried. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much information about where this statue actually came from. But we'll get into some more about him later. And lastly, there are two really distinctive features that this portrait has. The first is that he has no hair. He's bald or he's got a shaved head, which is pretty significant for Roman portraiture. And second is that he has this X-shaped marking on his forehead. So who is this guy? The combination of these last two features is really key here. We're looking at a priest of the Egyptian goddess Isis. So we have a range of ancient sources from the Greek author Herodotus in the 5th century BCE to some Roman writers in the 2nd century CE, contemporary with our sculpture, who talk about priests of Egyptian gods shaving their heads. That's one clue. The X-shaped mark is a little bit trickier. It's contested among scholars if this specifically relates to the goddess Isis. We're going to kind of go with it. One useful bit of evidence we have is this portrait. I am struggling to find more photos of it, but he is recorded as having one of these markings. And you can see in the particular garment he's wearing kind of wraps around his torso. We can compare it to some other images of priests of Isis, in this case, a wall painting from the Bay of Naples. We'll come back to the larger wall painting there. We do have some other references in text to priests kind of marking themselves out in some way, whether through kind of branding or tattoos or some other means. So we can pull out two kind of key aspects about our head here. He's a priest, a religious office holder, and he's a priest specifically of an Egyptian goddess. So I want to start with, we'll kind of explore both of these aspects. And I want to start with that second one, this Egyptian aspect, and the Egyptomania part of my title. So I'm curious if anyone here has had a quote unquote Egypt phase, a time in your life when you're very interested in ancient Egypt, lots of hands left to see it. I had a big one in 6th grade social studies. Here I am many years later. My research in grad school did get a little bit away from Egypt, but it's still something that I'm really fascinated by. So we are in this room are not alone in being fascinated by ancient Egypt. The ancient Romans were also obsessed with ancient Egypt, which is this phenomenon that we sometimes call Egyptomania. They did not think extraterrestrials built the pyramids, and neither should we. But there are a couple of reasons that they were really fascinated by ancient Egypt. One of them is that ancient Egypt is super, super, super old, right? even to Romans living 2,000 years ago. And you might have heard this fun fact that I have attempted to illustrate very roughly here, right? That we live today, we are here in the Allen in 2024, we live closer in time to Cleopatra, the famous last non-Roman ruler of Egypt. She died in 30 BCE when Egypt was conquered by Rome. So we live closer in time to Cleopatra than Cleopatra did to the building of the Great Pyramids. And by like 500 years, it's not particularly close, right? So you're a first, second century CE Roman. Egypt is already really ancient, right? So this is fascinating to people living in antiquity. Another reason for this interest in Egypt is how unique the Egyptian landscape is, right? We have lots of stark desert, and then we have this massive life-giving river running through the center. And even today, right, as we can see from satellite imagery, this contrast is really striking. The Nile River in antiquity flooded regularly, which made the valley incredibly fertile. And this cyclical, life-giving nature of the floods was viewed as having a cosmological significance and was really highly revered. The source of the Nile was also unknown in antiquity, which is a very fun mystery. We have records of expeditions up the Nile to try to figure out where it starts. And we have a bunch of cool examples of Romans decorating their homes and some public buildings with this very watery landscape, and particularly with its very distinctive flora and fauna. So things like lotus plants, crocodiles, hippos, things you don't see in other parts of the Mediterranean. My favorite example is the Nile mosaic from Palestrina, Italy, from the 2nd century BCE. This is a me for scale, right? So it is a gigantic mosaic. It's this kind of wild imagining of the Nile Valley in flood. So at the bottom, you have the delta where it empties into the Mediterranean, and then it kind of winds up to the south up at the top. There's a couple detail shots. It's filled with a ton of interesting animals and landmarks. And some animals, as you get up near the top of the mosaic, the mysterious kind of source of the river, we have animals that seem to be kind of strange, hybrid, mythical, not real creatures. So showing off some of this interest in the unknown aspects of the landscape. Here's another example, just for fun, in a wall painting from Pompeii. We're looking at the side of an outdoor dining bench. It's hard to make out some of the colors. Oh, actually, it's much better on the screen than on my computer. The very blue landscape, right? Again, we're looking at the Nile River. We have some people banqueting with a crocodile in front, and then off to the right, a structure that looks very distinctive, sort of Egyptian monument. Speaking of these monuments, right, exploring different monuments around the Mediterranean, especially in Rome, is a great way to see other ways this interest in Egypt manifested itself. So Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, actually wholesale moves different things like this obelisk from Egypt to the city of Rome, where you can still see it today. So sometimes it's actually sort of importing or forcibly importing Egyptian monuments and objects. And we also have some imitation. So this is the tomb of Gaius Cestius, a well-off Roman who decides in the 1st century BCE that he also wants a pyramid, still part of the landscape of the city today in a really fun way. If you were a well-off Roman, you might also go to Egypt as a tourist. One cool case of this on the left is a photograph in our collection of the so-called statues or colossus of Memnon. These are, I think, circa 1300 BCE statues for the pharaoh Amenhotep III. We have over 100 inscriptions, especially kind of around the feet, of basically Greeks and Romans visiting these statues, kind of scratching into it. So some pretty good evidence for tourism here. Romans were also really intrigued by Egyptian gods and goddesses, perhaps something that many of us can relate to. Isis, our focus, and here's a couple examples of her imagery here, was a really major goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. She's the sister and the consort of the god Osiris, who's another very important deity. And in a very important myth, Osiris is killed by his brother and he's dismembered. Isis takes it upon herself to get all his pieces together, put him back together, revive him, and then she gets pregnant by him. A good classic wild myth. Osiris unfortunately has to stay in the underworld after this, but there's still this really important aspect of life and death and resurrection that will come up throughout this talk. So Isis wears a lot of hats in the Egyptian pantheon. She's the mythological mother of all pharaohs. She was an important goddess of motherhood. She has an important role to play in the cosmos, right? She does a lot of stuff. A pretty cool aspect of her worship in Egypt that we have here at the Allen is this fragmentary object. And it's small, easy to overlook in the case, but I also encourage you to go find it after this. It's a piece of something called a sistrum, which is a type of musical instrument. So we're looking at basically a face here, and it's only one piece of this type of object. So here's a complete example from Lumet's collection. The lower portion would serve as a handle. Then you have the head above it. And then at the top in the side view, right, you can see those three holes. So you would put bars, maybe with small plates on them, through those holes, and then you could shake it like a rattle. So it makes this rattling sound. And here is a bronze example for comparison. We have a bunch of examples in bronze. Ours is made of faience, which is this type of ceramic. So probably wouldn't have been quite as durable as our bronze examples, and maybe was more used as a kind of gift to a god rather than a everyday use musical instrument. And we'll come back to these as well in the Roman context. So interest in Isis spreads around the Mediterranean in the first millennium BCE, partly through Greek traders. And by the first century BCE, the worship of Isis is well established in Italy. For Greeks and for Romans, and here I have a couple of Roman period images of Isis, she retains her associations with things like marriage and childbirth and fertility and the cosmos. I think this is kind of fun. She also becomes an important protector of harbors and seafarers, which may be due in part to the fact that Egypt is the main grain supplier to the Roman Empire. So I want to get into how Romans worshipped Isis. We're going to take a little detour first into some background on Roman religion. So like the Egyptians, Romans had many different gods, each with kind of their own sphere of influence. The basic tenet of Roman religion is you keep the gods happy and bad things won't happen. You do your sacrifices, you do your rituals, right? And things will work out for you. Roman civic offices and important institutions also had deities associated with them. So you had to make sure you were doing the right things for major gods like Jupiter to make sure that everything in society ran smoothly. So basically participation in these religious affairs is kind of a matter of public interest. A fun aspect of Roman religion, and very crucial for Isis, is that new gods could be added to this pantheon. So we don't have a set list. And typically this happens as Rome conquers new parts of the world. Basically, if they also took on worshiping the Roman gods, you find temples to gods like Jupiter kind of dotted around the empire. As long as you do that part of it, you can continue to worship your own gods. They're fine with that. And in some cases, gods from these various local and regional cultures become widely popular and their worship spreads all around. Basically, this is what happens with Isis. We have evidence for her worship in practically every part of the empire, which is wild. Okay, long detour. Let's get back to our guy for a second. So what does it mean to be a priest of Isis in the 2nd century CE in the Roman world? What does worshiping Isis look like? So for Romans, the cult of Isis is what we call a mystery cult. And to explain what that means, I'm going to do, again, a very slight detour into another couple aspects of Roman religion. So we know there's many gods, right? They need to be placated with sacrifices and rituals. So you could, we as individuals could go to temples, leave our little offerings. But there were also important festivals or holidays for different gods throughout the year. And as an aside, Romans had a ton of holidays, so we should all be pushing for more days off in our calendar. These holiday rituals were usually completed by priests in public settings, typically at an altar in front of a temple. The priests for many gods, and particularly the main civic gods, were usually more elite men. Women could be priestesses, but only in some cases, and lower classes had less access. So the worship of Isis as a mystery cult looked a bit different in some regards. One main characteristic of mystery cults is that there's a secret initiation into them. In traditional Roman religion, right, you and your community, so say us as the community of Oberlin College, you might have a particular god or goddess that you favor a little bit more, but ultimately there isn't really a process by which you become someone who is part of Roman religion. It's kind of just what you're expected to do, right? Public interest. In a mystery cult, you voluntarily decide to join, And then you become part of this community of worshipers through the initiation rites. And as a side note, you do this alongside the kind of traditional Roman religious practice. Part of the fun of calling these mystery cults is that many aspects of them are still a mystery to us. Like what exactly this initiation process looks like, we don't really know. We have a really fun reference to an initiation in a novel called The Golden Ass, or The Metamorphosis, but The Golden Ass is more fun, by an author named Apuleius. And this is a work written in Latin in the 2nd century CE. And if you're looking for your next read or a good summer read, I cannot recommend this enough. It is wild. It's this very lively story of a man who gets, his name is Lucius, he gets accidentally turned into a donkey. He goes on all sorts of wild adventures. And eventually, he's turned back into a human through the intervention of the goddess Isis, who says, I'll tell you how to turn back into a human, and then you have to join my cult, basically, undergo these initiation rites. So Lucius agrees. He's turned back into a human. Now he has to go through this whole process. So priests read to him from a ritual book. He has to be purified. He has to confess his wrongdoings. There's a bunch of other steps. And then he gives us the following details about what happened after he enters the innermost sanctuary of the temple during his initiation. And apologies for the block of text. I am going to read it, but it's fun. Perhaps, eager reader, and this is Lucius speaking directly to us, perhaps, eager reader, you have a certain pressing curiosity about what was said and what was done at that point. I would tell you if telling were permitted, you could learn of it if you were allowed to hear. And then he says, but I won't torment you too much. Here's a little bit of detail. I approached the boundary of death and placed my foot on Proserpina's threshold. And Proserpina is Persephone, like Persephone, goddess of the underworld. I made my way through every level of the universe and back. In the middle of the night, I saw the sun flashing in the purest brightness. I came face to face with the gods below and the gods above. So there it is. I have related what you must not truly know. Likewise, I shall continue to report only what can be, without sin, revealed to the minds of the uninitiated. Okay, so what the heck does this mean? The language is very grandiose, right? Very metaphorical. And clearly Apuleius has Lucius keep his secrets because we, the readers, might be uninitiated. But from this description, we can imagine that light and sound played important roles, probably in perhaps jarring ways. And there was perhaps some acting out of traveling to the underworld and back. And I should mention there's maybe a bit of satire in Apuleius's account of the initiation. So Lucius goes through multiple rounds of this initiation, basically rising through the ranks of priests in this cult. Each one costs him large sums of money to the point where he's almost kind of destitute in between, which might be a commentary on contemporary religious authority. So a little questionable. But even though we don't get complete information, and even though this comes to us in this very fictional tale, it does seem like Apuleius, our author, has some knowledge of Isaic ritual in the 2nd century. We can look to some archaeological evidence for a little more information. So we're looking here at the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. So we have an image of the temple and a plan on the left. So the temple's pretty closed off from the streets around it. That arrow shows our really only entrance. And in the photograph, we're kind of standing at that entrance looking diagonally out. Other temples in the city and in other Roman cities are much more accessible. There's also a pool here for part of that kind of ritual purification, cleansing yourself. And likely the waters were meant to kind of symbolize the Nile River, which is where Osiris's parts were scattered. And we have this space in the back that may have been for gatherings of the initiated, right? So we have some setup for both the initiation and for creating a space for people to gather in these secret ways. Well, I tell you the next bit, we'll look at this fun 18th century etching, probably a little bit sort of over the top of what's going on in this temple in Pompeii. So mystery cults also very crucially promise those who undergo initiation an afterlife. What happens to you after you die in terms of traditional Roman religion is a bit murky, and this is both, it seems, for Romans and for us studying them. So it's not really clear where you go when you die for your typical Roman, even if you do all the right things for Jupiter and the rest of the gang, which is kind of a concerning proposition, right? Mystery cults do promise you an afterlife if you undergo initiation. And the cult of Isis works really well in this regard, right? If you remember, the main story about Isis in Egyptian mythology is her bringing her dead husband back to life, right? perhaps the initiation involves some reenactment of this myth. So again, these themes of life and death and rebirth really resonated in these communities, right? Romans want to guarantee themselves some sort of life after they died. Okay, so we have voluntary participation, secret initiations, and afterlife promises. And these are present in most mystery cults. There are a number of other ones besides the cult of Isis. But another kind of cool aspect of the cult of Isis that I think is worth mentioning is who could participate in it. So I mentioned before, priesthoods and prominent positions were generally limited to men in the upper echelon of society and much of Roman religion. This is less true for the cult of Isis. People of any social class could join, and it seems like almost every sector of Roman society is represented. So we have documentation for enslaved and formerly enslaved Romans, all the way up to members of the imperial family. There were more opportunities for people to be priests, and even women could be priestesses up to similar levels as men. We have some cool evidence for the kind of possibilities of social mobility the cult afforded. Again, we'll go back to the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. We have this dedicatory inscription. It reads, Numerius Papidius Celsinus, son of Numerius, at his own expense. Romans love to tell you when they paid for something not with your tax dollars. At his own expense, restored from its foundations the Temple of Isis, which had collapsed in the earthquake. There was a major earthquake in 62 CE, a little bit before Vesuvius erupts in 79 and buries the city. Because of his generosity, although he was 6 years old, the counselors enrolled him in their number without fee. I appreciate the laughter here. This sounds kind of wacky, right? A 6-year-old is paying for a temple and joining the city council, right? Sounds weird. It's mostly accurate, but there's a bit of a twist here. So one of the really great things about Pompeii, because it's buried by Vesuvius and we have this rich source of information, is that we can trace certain names around the city. We have inscriptions and graffiti and other types of records. And the father here, Numerius, is someone that we have referenced elsewhere. His full name is Numerius Papidius Ampliatus. He's a former slave, part of a social class called freedmen. So once you're freed from slavery, Roman men in particular have certain opportunities. So you could accumulate a lot of wealth, and they could vote, for example, but they were still barred from a number of activities like holding public office or holding important priesthoods or achieving various class ranks. The twist is that once you're freed, any children born after that time have full rights of Roman citizenship. So you have access to pretty much everything. So what we're looking at here is a way that devotion to the cult of Isis has granted these parents the opportunity to kind of vault their son into these social and political classes that they themselves could never achieve. So by rebuilding the temple in his son's name and getting him a spot on the city council, Ampliatus has set his son on this really promising path. Okay, it's been a long time. Let's go back to this guy. So in all of this, right, he would have been responsible for carrying out these initiation rites and for running the worship of Isis more generally. Here's an image of a man in a wall painting with a shaved head, this linen garment, and holding a sistrum, clearly a priest of Isis. Apuleius mentions the sistrum in processions for the goddess, so wielding these, making this noise would have been part of the priest's job. Here's another great image of priests of Isis from Herculaneum, right? Another city on the Bay of Naples buried by the eruption of Vesuvius. We saw the man right in the middle earlier. He's, of course, again, very recognizable for his shaved head and for the garment wrapped around his torso. In the rest of the scene, we have other priests and worshipers standing around. We have them all standing in front of a temple. And we can't see a bunch of the temple, but we have some stairs leading up to it. And then we have the altar out front, very, very common. We have crowds of worshipers, and the priests hold a range of objects. And up at the top of the stairs, the guy in the middle seems to be holding some sort of vessel, maybe with sacred water. The guy to the right might be holding, again, another sistrum. There's some great clues besides the people, right, that we're looking at a temple to Isis, particularly in the plants and animals. We have palm trees on either side of the temple. We have these very distinctive birds, the ibis, in front of the altar and dotted around, right? Again, showing how fascinating the Egyptian landscape and its plants and animals was to Romans. And something else we should look at in this image is the skin colors of the priests. So you might notice that some have darker skin tones, some have lighter skin tones. Part of this might be sort of creating this fictional, exotic kind of character of Egypt, but this might probably actually reflect actual practice. So some priests might have come from Egypt, but it seems like there didn't need to be a connection to Egypt, actually. Many were local to their communities, so this matches the general diversity of the Roman Empire. So we can imagine our priests carrying out offerings and rituals like this one, initiating new members, and perhaps when he still had paint, he looked like one of these men. Even if we're not exactly sure where this statue stood, he could have been local to that community or a priest who traveled to the area. So Lucius in our novel, for example, he's initiated in Greece and he ends up working in Rome. This man was likely well off to have had a statue made of him, but he would have been alongside people from all walks of life in the cult. The statue may have stood at his tomb or in sort of the complex of the temple, wherever he was a priest, honoring him in this role. So unfortunately, we can't pin down too many specifics about this man. He probably was not turned into a donkey at one point in his life, but he does survive as material evidence of several fascinating religious phenomena in ancient Rome. Thank you.